Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Okay, we're back. We're back with more live from the Heartland for the week of April 1st. And it really gives me a lot of pleasure to bring on an old friend. Not only are we old, but we haven't seen each other in a long time. The one and only Jim Russell, AKA James W. Russell. And we go back to our days in Students for Democratic Society. And we're both on a daily email of SDS people. And there's a lot of discussion, and I see his comments and the things that he's doing. I know he has a new book out, which we're going to talk a little bit about. He's also been making films. So this is a kind of a first step so that I have a real strong backlog of former comrades, current friends and comrades to come on the radio show. And so, Jim, we're going to do a little interview. Then we're going to send it to our daily thing so everyone can see it. And who knows who else out there among the masses will be watching, listening, Googling it, doing the whole thing. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Good to be on the show.
Where are you?
I am in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, nice. And have things toned down a little bit there from a few years back?
They have.
And the Bulls just played you guys, I think, and I think we won.
I don't know. You may be right.
Well, you know, I had not known that you were such a prolific author. When I was looking up some information, I know I had read one of your books, which I really loved. It was about a slave in Texas, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But then I know you have a new book out about the Labor Guide to Retirement Plans, which was published by one of our favorite publishers, Monthly Review Press. But it turns out you have 8 books out. And you've taught a lot of places. You've been a hotshot scholar, gone to other places to teach. Give us a little bit about yourself, what you did in the movement and what you've been doing since.
Well, I came into the movement through civil rights. In Oklahoma. I mean, not a lot of people know that Oklahoma had the first lunch counter sit-in of the modern civil rights movement in 1958, which predated the Greensboro one, which is more famous. And then it had the last major one, which was in Tulsa in 1964, before the first of the Civil Rights Acts. And so I was involved in CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. I was in the lunch counter sit-ins, arrested 3 times. And then I got involved in a project integrating the schools of a nearby town, Sand Springs, which is my latest video. And during all that time, I was a member of SDS. Okay, we started a chapter at the University of Oklahoma in 1963. Okay, and then I went into the national office of SDS, was the first editor of New Left Notes, and spent a really exciting year working there in Chicago. And I have always been, since then, involved in some sort of a project. So I never became older and wiser and toned down my politics or anything like that. I mean, that was just a tremendously formative period for me.
And where did you teach?
Well, I've taught all over the place. I taught at San Francisco State. I taught at Lewis and Clark in Portland. I taught at the National Autonomous University in Mexico City for 2 years. And then I taught at Eastern Connecticut State University. And my last place was Portland State.
I gave a talk there many years ago. I think Roger Lippman brought me up there to speak way, way back. I love Oklahoma. I used to think of it as a there was the Green Corn Rebellion in Oklahoma, where
Yeah,
blacks and Mexicans and Indians and some whites all stood up to conscription for the First World War. And, and then we have a friend who wrote that book, Red Dirt, Oklahoma.
yeah.
Yeah,
Roxanne Dunbar.
yeah, Roxanne. And we got to get her on. But let me, one of the first communiques you had or contacts we had again in recent years was when you got me a copy of your novel it's called Escape from Texas, a novel of slavery and the Texas War of Independence. And, that was, it came out in 2012. It goes back to 1828 when there was still slavery, but I think Mexico had gotten rid of slavery. Tell us a little bit about that book and how you came to do it.
Well, I think the best single book about the Southwest is still Carrie McWilliams' 1949 book, North from Mexico, okay, about how, long before the Pilgrims, there were people who migrated up into what is now the United States. And in that book, there is one short paragraph where he says that during the 1820s and 1830s, there was a small community of escaped slaves in Matamoros, Mexico. Okay, it's a very short paragraph, and that had always fascinated me. And so I decided to research it. How big was this? And to the best that I can judge, there were probably more slaves that escaped south to Mexico than north to Canada, even though the Underground Railroad and all of that is much more famous, because it makes sense geographically, because Mexico is contiguous to the south. And so I did a lot of research on it, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with all this research? And I thought, why don't I just tell it as a story?
Yeah.
Okay, and make some characters to represent the major historical forces that were in operation at that time. Whites that were coming in from the US, Mexican communities, Indians, and of course, slaves. Because when you look at the Texas War of Independence, which is this, shrine in American history, the Alamo, and you look at what that was all about, it wasn't really about freedom and independence, except for the slave owners. Because the first thing the Republic of Texas did when it wrote its Constitution was to legalize slavery. And then slavery expanded fivefold after that. So, I took the angle of the slaves who escaped, but also tried to portray all of those kinds of events.
It's a great book, and if you have a copy of it, any of you people listening or watching, it's worth some money. I was looking it up today, and I can't find my copy. I probably loaned it to someone, said, this is a great book, read it. I don't know where it is, but I saw that a used paperback copy of that book was $109 this morning.
Oh, that's a ripoff.
So I'm sure it is. Maybe you got copies, you can make a buck.
Well, I can tell you where to get it is Sloan Publishing. Get it straight from the publisher.
Good. One of the things now, since we're focusing on here on Oklahoma a little bit, you most recently have been involved with a civil rights film, which about desegregation when it came to Sam Springs. Tell us a little bit about that work, how you got into making film and what that film is about.
Well, in 1964, after the Tulsa sit-ins, I was living in Sand Springs, which is just outside of Tulsa, and I noticed that the schools were still completely segregated 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education. So once the Civil Rights Act passed at the end of July in 1964, we were having a core meeting and looking around for what to do next. And I raised the question of Sand Springs, and they said, sure, go. And so a couple of people agreed to help with it. And we went out canvassing in the community and found a lot of interest in integrating the schools. And so we were building up for a community meeting. And this leads to my favorite civil rights story. And we were in this small hamlet called outside of Sand Springs. And they said, well, you ought to go talk to Mr. Haynes. And I knew who Mr. Haynes was. Mr. Haynes was Marcus Haynes. Okay, he was the dribbler on the Harlem Globetrotters. Okay, and is a member of the NBA Hall of Fame. Okay, at this point. Okay, so he's a very, very famous person who had grown up in Sand Springs. And despite his world fame, his children weren't allowed to go to the white schools of Sand Springs. So we went to his house, nobody home. Okay, but left a note talking about this community meeting that evening. So the community meeting is there. People are debating back and forth whether to go for integration. Teachers are opposed to it. Parents are in favor of it. And then somebody stands up and says, we don't need integration because a lot of very accomplished people have gone through our school, and mentions Marcus Haynes. Then this voice comes from the back of the church. Wait a second, I want to speak. As this man makes his way to the front, and it's Marcus Haynes. And he says, it's true that I've been very successful in life because I had a very unusual skill, but I never wanted to be a basketball player. I wanted to be a printer, but I couldn't be a printer because the white school had a printing program, but our school did not. And so he won that argument with a dunk shot, so to speak. And he was then selected as a spokesperson for the group because there was nothing they could do to him. He was not vulnerable. By that time, he owned a team called the Harlem Magicians.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So he was untouchable. And so we all went to the school board meeting. They refused. And then we filed the first complaint in Oklahoma under the new Civil Rights Act. The U.S. attorney contacted the school board, and they immediately collapsed. And the school was integrated. Well, that story generally got lost over the years. And in the last 3 or 4 years, I've managed to contact Black students from the integration and white students who were in the school. And we put up a historical marker in the school commemorating that event. So this video is about the 1964 event and then the commemoration of it with a historical marker.
So it's a video that people can get at, or do you have to buy it or find it?
There's a trailer of it on YouTube, and probably within days, I'm going to put up a way to buy a DVD of it.
Oh, this is great. I'm looking forward to it. I always did like Oklahoma. I think I said that earlier. But I always am kind of troubled by how Oklahoma had a strong socialist base in the early 1900s, and it's now, aside from its marijuana growing, which it's really over the top, growing a lot of marijuana, but it's really a kind of a conservative, right-wing red state. That may not be true of Tulsa or Oklahoma City. Can you give us a little hint on why Oklahoma went from being in the forefront of being a progressive kind of state to being one of the most reactionary?
Well, it went from red to red, but different meanings of red, right?
A good red to the bad red.
Right, exactly. I don't have a nifty theory of it, but I'll correct you in one detail.
Good.
Tulsa and Oklahoma City voted Republican.
They did.
There was no redeeming virtue. All 77 counties voted Republican. I even went down to the precinct level looking for, not even Norman, the university town, voted Democrat, or Stillwater, another university town. I went down to the precinct level, and every once in a while you'd see, a Democratic precinct, but by and large, it was just a sea of red. So it's unlike Texas, where the big towns vote Democrat, and then the suburbs and the exurbs are the ones that vote Republican. Oklahoma is just across the board. Now, that said, there is probably a third to 40% of the people in Oklahoma vote Democrat. So it's not like it's just a total,
Well, it's probably another case of severe gerrymandering too.
Well, I don't even think they have to gerrymander.
They don't have to.
Yeah.
Well, we're striking out on finding a good point for Oklahoma. So let's move on. In addition to that, the movie you made, desegregation came to Sand Springs. Were you also involved with a film about the Wisconsin teachers' assistant strike from back in the day?
Right.
Tell our listeners about that, because I'm sure there's a lot of film buffs, including our engineer, who probably would want to go see that film.
Well, in 1970, the Wisconsin Teaching Assistants Association had the first TA strike in the history of the United States. And I was a member of it, as were two other people, and none of us had ever made a film. And so, but we decided to try to make a film because this was a historical event. And so I think we set a world record for low budget films. For under $400, we made this film. And I hate to say it, it was a really terrible film. It was a good example of bad left-wing filmmaking. And so it kind of became very quickly lost, or so I thought. Then after I retired, I had always felt very badly about that film. And so I decided there was a lot of good stuff in it, okay, but kind of the way it was structured and all of that, you would have had to have been there to even understood it. So I re-edited it to make it more relevant to graduate student organizing today. And I think it's a halfway decent film.
I'm going to watch it. James W. Russells. I know a lot of Jim Russells. I know two other guys.
Oh,
there was
really?
one in Rising Up Angry who was a Korean War vet. And then there's another guy who is a fireman in town here. But you got the W. And one of the things we talked about most recently was your new book. Why don't you give us a little bit about this, and we'll let the other 6 books that you've written go to another time. But tell us a little about this, and then I want to get at a couple other things before we close out.
Sure. I never would have predicted when I was in SDS that I'd become totally fascinated with retirement plans. But I have. I was involved in leading a movement in Connecticut from about 2008 to 2013, which resulted in us being able to change out of a 401k plan, which would have had a miserable retirement with it, to the state's pension plan. It was one of the few victories like that, because everybody's being pushed in the opposite direction. And something like $400 million then changed from the 401ks into the state pension fund. And during that, I encountered, it was a rank and file union movement. And during that, I encountered a lot of union people who really didn't know very much about retirement plans, as important as they are to working people. And so the premise of the book is to write a book that's from the point of view of working people, not from the point of view of the financial services industry, the banks, the insurance companies, and all the others that profit off of retirement plans, but from working people and what people basically need to know about Social Security and workplace retirement plans.
Well, I am in the Screen Actors Guild, and I'm really glad I got enough work in to get a pension from them. But a lot of people are really concerned, and and as we live longer, I can see a lot of people wondering how they're going to get by. James Russell, let's go to we on our SDS daily communique with a lot of people. Someone raised this film that was just on PBS, and I saw it last night, or I think it was last night. And it is about I'm pulling a blank here, but it's a film about it's called The Madman, The Movement and the Madman. Let's start over, Cal. Some of the people on our SDS email site daily have been talking about a film that PBS just showed called The Movement and the Madman. And it's about the anti-war movement, a lot after kind of SDS had done a bunch of stuff. Why don't you give us a short take on what you thought about the film and why it's important for people to watch it?
Well, you may have noticed that when you go back to the great movements of the 1960s, civil rights, anti-war, women's movement, that civil rights and women's movement are okay. They were good and noble. But somehow the anti-war movement has been dropped out of the picture and is somewhat suspicious. And that's probably because we're continuing to fight wars. And so it's not a great example for those who promote those wars. So I think that this film is a wonderful antidote to that because it really, Steve Talbot and the people he worked with collected an enormous amount of footage and really showed how big and vibrant that movement was. And they also claim that it was responsible for stopping Nixon and Kissinger from using nuclear weapons in Vietnam. Okay. So I think overall it's a tremendous film. My only criticism of it is that it seemed to overly emphasize the role of Harvard University in a couple of seminars where people came up with the idea of this mobilization. And then most of the universities that were portrayed were private universities rather than public. And so it kind of tilted it up in terms of what this movement was. It also did not have very much context about the prior marches on Washington, okay, or the just widespread, set of activities around the country. And so you kind of got a sense, I don't know, maybe I'm being a little bit over dramatic, that this was a Harvard project or something like that. And so I was critical of that. That could have been easily fixed, but
yeah, I have a feeling they'll show that movie a bunch. I know in some places they didn't show it yet, but it's worth seeing. We're going to run out of time, Jim, but I'm going to ask you, fire one last thing at you. And of course, I'm inviting you back right now to come on. Whenever you want to come on, you got something you want to share. We can do this more often. But where do you see the nation right now? I know this is rough in a short amount of time, but where do you see the nation and what do you think people should be doing, people of conscience?
Well, I'm very pessimistic at the moment because of this war that's going on. It's a war that was started by two wrongs, NATO expansion and a Russian invasion. And it seems like the vast majority of people are looking for a victory in it rather than a way to negotiate an end to it. And if you're looking for a victory, it's going to go on for a long, long time. And so, yeah, and then we look at the two political parties. The Democrats are essentially the war party, as they were in 1968, the Chicago Convention, and the Republicans are a kind of neo-fascist party. And so, there's not a lot of options in there. So I don't have a magic solution to this, but don't give up. History always, surprises you. And maybe, we will find some light at the end of this particular tunnel.
Well, I certainly hope so. I know we got an election coming up here that gives us a stark contrast between a progressive African-American, Johnson, running against Vallis, who's really a Republican. And who would have thought that this would rear its ugly head again? But, I do believe things, I used to be a meliorist. I believed that things would get better, but it's not necessarily so. But I'm working that way. And I think in a lot of parts of the country, there are a lot of very aware young people, as well as older people like you and I. And we're all doing something to try to make it a better place. So I know you'll be doing good in the world. I'll keep trying, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon, James. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike.